Welcome to our second international webinar for Towards the National Collection. As you know, Towards the National Collection is an AHRC program where we're trying to identify how we can integrate digital collections, all the new computational advancements, digital humanities, how do we take these technologies to different parts of the world, how do we bring the different knowledge from different parts of the world. So we have this new webinar on African and Indigenous futures, harnessing AI for the Global South languages. So yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting. So welcome everybody. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We have two presentations, one from Robert Pugh, then it's going to be followed by Ignatius Ezeani, and then we're going to go for Q&A. As always, this webinar is going to be recorded. After the recording will be posted in our YouTube channel, which Sophie, which is on the background, taking care that nothing breaks. She will be posting later on this video on YouTube. So everybody else besides the speakers cannot turn on their cameras or their microphones, so you won't be recorded. The chat is open if you want to have a conversation. We don't store the chat, and the chat is not published on the YouTube channel. We also have the Q&A panel. If you check on the bottom right of Zoom, you have an ellipsis, 3 dots with that says more. From there, you can open your chat panel. You can also open the Q&A panel. So we would like to ask everybody here, if you have any questions, please post them on the Q&A, and our speakers, same as ourselves, we can see the Q&A and we can start flagging up some questions and perhaps redirecting the conversation at the end of the webinar for the Q&A. Which, as mentioned, we have up to half an hour for Q&A, so it's usually very nice to hear kind of this unfiltered answers or these different perspectives of in the Q&A panel. So at the end of the webinar, when we open the Q&A, you can raise your hand to raise a question, and I can perhaps ask you to turn on your microphone if you would like to ask the question verbally. And of course, keep in mind that if you decide to ask the question verbally, which means using your phone and your voice, you will be recorded and then posted on YouTube. So if you don't want to be recorded, please post your question on the Q&A panel. Okay, so also please follow us on our different social media channels on Twitter, Towards Our Collection, join our mailing list, join our YouTube channel, and everything will be linked in there. So yeah, feel free to use the chat and introduce yourselves. So with that ado, let me introduce the first presenter, Robert Pugh, who's going to be talking about indigenous voices, past, present, and future, digital technologies for Nahuatl and Maya. Nahuatl and Maya are two most widely spoken indigenous languages in Mexico, along with many of the other Mesoamerican languages. They share notable sociolinguistic features, wide dialectical and orthographic variations, and a rich pre-post-colonial literacy tradition and external languages contact with Spanish, with the Spanish cultures. So Robert is a PhD student in computational linguistics at Indiana University in Bloomington. His work focuses on language technology for Mexican languages, exploring its role in reversing language shift, language documentation, and quantitative linguistics analytics. His research interest includes NLP, or natural language processing, for related languages, varieties, language contact, and multilingualism, and computational morphosyntaxis or morphosyntax. So Rob, welcome, and thank you very much for joining this international webinar. So whenever you're ready, please start sharing your screen.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Let me share now. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yes, coming up. Got it. Perfect.
You still see? You can't see the presenter view, right?
No, it's perfect. This is the
Okay,
right view.
excellent.
Awesome.
Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. That'll save me a few slides in the beginning. Um, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about digital languages, language technology for Nahuatl and Maya today. Um, so basically, I'm going to give a quick overview so you know what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to speak really briefly about myself. I'll probably skip most of that because I think the introduction did a lot of that for me. Um, I'm going to offer a very quick overview of the two languages that I'm focusing on, and then the rest of the talk I'll discuss language technology as applied to these languages. And I'm going to try to divide this discussion into a past section, which talks about working with historical documents, um, a present section, which is working with language documentation, maintenance, revitalization, and language activism, and a future section, which is mostly just aimed to look at sort of the future of alignment between indigenous communities and NLP research. So yeah, so the introduction I think did a better job than this introducing me, but basically I got my start as a sort of a software engineer focusing on NLP, and I spent about 8 years in industry working on software, nothing to do with indigenous languages or with Nahuatl. My wife, who was a Nahuatl speaker, started teaching me Nahuatl in order to better communicate with her family. And that's sort of how I started getting interested in combining these two things that I was working on. And then with the birth of my daughter, it kind of like in this concern that we had that she learn Nahuatl, her native tongue, um, started motivating me to look more seriously at NLP targeted towards language maintenance and digital language revitalization. And then once starting at IU, I was exposed to Maya, taking Maya language classes with Ketsi Castañeda. So before starting most of the content, I want to go through a few definitions. Throughout the talk, I used the terms digital language technology, human language technology, and NLP kind of interchangeably. My sort of working definition is that digital language technology refers to any computer program, machine readable artifact that can be encoded using human language, accepts human language input, or produces human language output in any modality. And others previously have typically tried to also separate the idea of language technology, which refers to the actual applications that do language processing, and language resources, which are the data on which those language technologies are based. So throughout the rest of the talk, there's going to be a few things that come up a number of times, and so I want to kind of highlight them first so that they're not lost. First, the perspective I take during this talk prioritizes technology applications over methods. So you're not going to see any real state-of-the-art methods being described. Instead, for me, what's most important is identifying practical and implementable solutions that are appropriate for a specific language situation and context. So a lot of the projects I described talk about knowledge-based symbolic techniques, like things like finite state transducers, rules-based methods, which require knowledge of a language and domain, but not necessarily large amounts of labeled data. And I'll also talk about approaches that use pre-trained deep learning models, which have also been shown to be effective, and how we can use these knowledge-based approaches to create data for training data-driven methods. And then finally, I describe typically language technology as tools and resources for achieving some goal for a community, and not necessarily as things that sort of have value in and of themselves. Okay, so here's a little overview of the languages. Both Nahuatl and Maya are spoken in Mexico. Nahuatl has 30 recognized groups by the variants by the National Institute of Indigenous Languages in Mexico. There's about 1.7 million speakers that speak these variants. It is an agglutinating, polysynthetic, and head marking language, which basically means that you get a lot of heavily inflected words, a lot of single word sentences. Maya is primarily spoken in the Yucatan Peninsula. There's about 800,000 speakers, and after Nahuatl, so it's the second most widely spoken indigenous language in Mexico. So these two are the two most widely spoken. Maya is also agglutinating and head marking. It's not polysynthetic like Nahuatl, so we don't get these like super long sentence words. Some important sociolinguistic characteristics are that both of these languages, to different extents, exhibit a lot of variation. So they on multiple dimensions. So There's orthographic variation, diachronic or variation over time, and a lot of diatopic or geographic variation. And so I think Nahuatl, in terms of diatopic variation, Nahuatl has quite a bit more than Maya, but Maya still shows a lot of diatopic variation also. These tables I have, the table on the top right shows just one word from Nahuatl in 4 different variants, 4 of the 30. And so you can kind of see there's a couple of different linguistic isoglosses represented, as well as a few of the different orthographic norms. Isoglosses, things like the way the last morpheme in this word, which is the root, is changed to form the preterite. Isoglosses about whether or not to include this prefix O, which is an antecessive used in past tenses. The table on the bottom is an example of a sentence written in 3 of the many possible standardized orthographies for Maya. And even if there's a number of standards, like I'm saying, there's also native speakers typically, unless they've received extensive formal education in their language, typically will write in sort of their own ways. And importantly, all these sociolinguistic characteristics I'm describing are also fairly common in the rest of Mesoamerica. But Nahuatl and Maya, even though they're the most widely spoken languages in Mexico, are seeing alarming rates of decline in intergenerational transmission. And the National Institute of Indigenous Languages considers them, along with the rest of the indigenous languages in Mexico, as at risk of being lost. And in Mexico, there are such things as bilingual indigenous schools, but in reality, even indigenous language speakers who go to these schools receive little to no instruction in their native language. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about some projects. I'm going to try and basically talk about how language technology can be applied to these languages, and I'm going to break it into a past section, a present section, and a future section. So to start with the past, this is, as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about historical documents. So both Nahuatl and Maya have very rich literary histories and legacies. Prior to the Spanish invasion, there was a lot of writing in Mesoamerica. Unfortunately, the Spanish destroyed most of the documents from this time. So I think there are no surviving original manuscripts from before the invasion written in Nahuatl, and maybe 4, if any, written in Maya. This image I have here is one of the Nahuatl surviving Nahuatl manuscripts. However, it is a copy of an original that came after the conquest. And early in the colonial period, there's also a lot of literature produced in both of these languages. So both languages, because they had this history of writing, quickly adapted the Latin alphabet and were able to begin writing the language. The image on the left is an excerpt from the Florentine Codex, which is an important work that is sort of an encyclopedic work of cultural history of the Nahuatl-speaking people. And on the right, we have the Chilambalam, which is written in Maya, that also sort of outlines a lot of history, religion, and folklore of the Maya people. In addition to these codices, which are really well known, there's also a lot of so-called mundane documents, things like wills and tributes, letters, bills of sale, that sort of thing. And so this also sort of contributes to this large corpus of texts in these languages from the colonial period. Okay, so how can language technologies be applied to help us understand these documents? So they can help us understand this corpus of historical documents by first of all, digitizing these original manuscripts and also linguistically annotating them. And for example, making them searchable, and that can enable sort of insights into indigenous thought and philosophy by enabling us to search for specific constructions, examples. It also can help us teach through these texts. So the examples I give are like, for instance, if you want to find all sentences that have a verb in the past tense, or you want to find a specific word that may be inflected in multiple different ways throughout the text, having some linguistic annotation enables you to access those. So a quick example project. This is something I've been working on for a little over a year now. This is an open free digital Florentine Codex. This project started as a collaboration with a philosophy PhD student who was focusing on the study of the Nahuatl conception of time. And she had a lot of issues searching for things so she was basically focusing on the Florentine Codex, and she had a lot of issues searching for things because I mentioned there's no free open digital version. So there are a few digital versions, but they're copyrighted. And so her idea was she wanted to be able to annotate things and then re-release them, which is not allowed given the copyright. And then also there's a lot of orthographic variation and a lot of inflection, which makes it really hard to search for things. So I give an example in this slide of the orthographic variation. This is one word, yauyot, which means war. And here are 5 examples of how it's written throughout the text. And this is not an exhaustive list. So there are also more instances of or different orthographies for this. So one of the things we're working on is normalizing the orthography and as well as digitizing the text and then providing linguistic annotations so that things can be searched for. So on the left, this top left, this is an example of the interface we're currently working on, which matches the image of the original manuscript, which is on the far left here, the left column, with a digitized version of that original orthography, which is in the middle, and then a sort of normalized, clean version on the right. And there's sort of 2 important things that we have to do to get this clean version. One is just changing the way that the words are spelled to make them consistent. And another is that there's a lot of tokenization issues because the original manuscript has a fixed width in the columns. And so a lot of words break over line, are split in 2 over line breaks. And so we have to both retokenize, so figure out if a line break is actually a space between words or if those 2 sections should be joined into a single word, and also normalize the orthography in the writing. We do this by first creating a rules-based solution. So we basically read through parts of the book and identified context that we could target for rewrite rules to normalize. And then once we were able to do that with enough to cover like maybe 2 or 3 of the 12 total books in this series, then we could use a neural network solution, the sequence-to-sequence model that trains on the data that we had generated with the rules-based method. And this basically treats the process of converting from original to clean text as a machine translation problem based on the characters. In the bottom, we have an example of a model. The bottom left is an example of a model of the morphology. So we also have do morphological analysis and annotate the text. We do this with a finite state transducer. And on the right, we have an example of the search interface that allows you to search for specific linguistic, you could search for keywords, linguistic constructions, things like that. And here you can see a little bit better the search interface. You see that the box in the top left allows you to search for a specific linguistic construction. In the middle here, we have a sentence that matches. And you can see the syntactic tree, and as well as each word has a series of morphological features. And so the morphological features in the syntactic tree are both things that we've added to this digital version to make it easier to search for. And one of the things that's important, for example, because I mentioned there's a lot of inflection, if you're interested in like a specific word, which in this case, we were interested in words that had to do with time. With this linguistic annotation, it's much simpler because you can search on the lemma of a word instead of searching for the surface form. So for example, in the word that I'm highlighting where it says morphology and this arrow points down here, this word, the surface form is named Mitskawas. The actual word, the root word of the verb is kawa, which means to leave or to let alone. And so if you just search for kawa as a keyword, you may not find this because this is heavily inflected. And so being able to search on the lemma is a really big help. We're also taking this, another kind of related project here is, or an extension of this project is translating this into contemporary variants of Nahuatl. Because understanding the original text, which is quite old at this point, is complicated by a lot of factors. One, the language has changed. 2, the orthography makes it challenging. And then also because contemporary Nahuatl speakers do not receive, like I mentioned, a lot of formal education in reading and writing in Nahuatl. Even if it were in their variant, it's like still a bit of a challenge. And so we're currently working with speakers to translate the original Nahuatl that we've now kind of cleaned up into different contemporary Nahuatl variants. And here's just a quick table of the progress we've made. So you can see most of the books have been normalized and tagged and analyzed. And the sort of the work that's left right now is the syntactic annotations. So we're definitely not the only people working on this type of stuff. So I wanted to just briefly highlight other work that's going on that I think is really important for accessing historical documents in Mexico. So definitely, if you get a copy of these slides, I think it'd be great to examine these, click through these links also. Okay, so in the next section, I'm going to talk about the present, which is where I want to discuss the ways in which language technology can be valuable for amplifying contemporary indigenous voices and knowledge. So given the endangered status of both Nahuatl and Maya and the prevalence of language shifts in a lot of communities, efforts to document existing language practices and indigenous perspectives is something that a lot of Nahuatl Maya communities find valuable. Of course, I have a little footnote here that it's important to make sure that documentation projects include indigenous communities in the planning and execution, and also make the primary data available to them, which has historically been an issue. So it's valuable to speak for language communities insofar as they're able to access the data. In addition to language documentation, there's also a lot of so there's this idea of language death, digital language death from Cornai 2012, which is essentially that increasingly communicative activities happen now in the digital sphere, and so languages that are underrepresented in the digital domain are therefore used less and less, and so this is contributing to language shift. And so it's definitely a sort of a bleak outlook. And in the paper, Cornai, I think, says something like 95% of languages are sort of digitally dead. I think that's very a bleak outlook. But at the same time, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that indigenous language communities are able to use the internet and are pushing to use the internet as an engaging tool for revitalization and activism. And this includes things like, so this highlights, I guess, to me, the importance of reading and writing online. This is just a quick example of like the top 3 are memes that are floating around. So there's a lot of Nahuatl and Maya memes on social media that I feel like are a good example of this sort of digital language activism. So increasing the presence of Nahuatl online. And then the bottom 2 are banners from language schools that teach Nahuatl online via Zoom or things like that. So I think this is another way in which the internet is being used to support these languages, is by disseminating the languages via instructions. And so my thesis here for the present section is that language technology should be looking to partner with, train, and support individuals and organizations working on language documentation, revitalization, and digital language activism. So I'm going to give a quick overview of ways that this can happen, and I'll outline 2 projects. So in the area of language documentation, there's been a lot of recent advance in NLP for different aspects of the language documentation process, things like ASR to automatically transcribe, to automatically translate recorded speech, automatic glossing from the text, and then even more recently, we're working on automatic glossing directly from audio, recorded audio. So those things can kind of help make the language documentation process maybe faster, a little bit easier, more accessible. And then for digital reading and writing and digital language activism, basic tools like spelling and grammar checkers, predictive keyboards, interactive text analysis for reading, and even ASR again, so being able to dictate messages, generate transcripts or subtitles is very useful. So now for a few project examples. The first one is one we worked on with the Open School of Ethnography and Anthropology, or OSEA, which is an organization based in Piste, Yucatan, and also in Indiana. And we're basically trying to build a suite of digital tools for Maya students and writers. So OSEA works with indigenous scholars, academics in Yucatan, and also has a big language teaching program. And so what we're trying to do is build this sort of suite of reading and writing tools that enable you to, for example, in the top right here, it's an example of a text that a student might read. And if you come across a word you're not familiar with, by clicking on the word, you can get some more additional information, things like the stem or the root maybe a gloss, and maybe some morphological information. And this can be customized so that if you're a Spanish speaker, like instead of the gloss being in English, it could be in Spanish. On the bottom, we have using the same basic fundamental technology, which is a finite state morphological analyzer. We can also generate a morphologically informed spell checker, which is meant to be used to help writers in the digital domain. And so this is an example of a prototype we built that is built into the open source word processor LibreOffice. Second project is working with a community radio station called Radio Tzinaca, and they broadcast from the Sierra Norte de Puebla. They have news programs, local folklore stories. They interview community members. And one of the things we're working on with them is they have a website with all the audio they've broadcasted, but there's no text for that audio. And so what we're trying to do is generate transcripts for them so that the programs can be searchable. And the technology we're using for this is a pre-trained representation. So a model of audio language model that is trained on a lot of audio text, which means we don't need as much to generate a good system for Nahuatl. And the bottom right, just an example of a prototype we've been building where the transcript is highlighted along with the audio. Okay, so for the future section, I'm basically just going to talk about ideas about alignment with values and what's driving NLP research. So I think importantly, a lot of NLP research progress has been driven and guided by commercial or national interests, which are not necessarily aligned with the interests of indigenous communities around the world. And so, in fact, they're probably more aligned with colonialism and capitalism, which are sort of the processes that actually cause language endangerment in the first place. And so I just wanted to point out that solving existing NLP tasks for indigenous languages is not necessarily, while that could be helpful, it's not necessarily the same as serving indigenous communities with NLP. So the success of digital language infrastructure depends a lot on collaboration between a lot of parties. And this list is not mutually exclusive. So indigenous individuals and organizations, software developers, researchers, and funding institutions all need to collaborate. And what makes this collaboration work, in my opinion, is the existence of free and open technology development. And furthermore, this idea of free and open collaboration and technology development is consistent or can be consistent with indigenous worldviews and values in Latin America. So I wanted to highlight this article, which I think is amazing. I really recommend everyone read it, that introduces the concept of tequiología. And this idea comes from a traditional cultural practice that's common throughout Mesoamerica called tequillo. In other places in Mexico, it's also called faena, which describes a labor carried out by an entire community for the common good. So examples are things like everyone coming together at a certain frequency to like fix a main road in the community, construct a public building, cleaning a local school, that kind of thing. And this article suggests how this idea of tequillo can also be applied to the development of language technology, or sorry, of technology in general. And I'm arguing that this should be also considered for language technology. And then finally, a very recent publication that I think should be published next month. That's a survey of NLP research in indigenous languages of Latin America. Includes a survey of researchers and indigenous communities. And one of the questions is about the challenges faced in NLP research for indigenous languages. And so I thought this was interesting that indigenous community respondents cited a lack of inclusion of indigenous communities in research process as one of the main challenges. And researchers cited the lack of access to resources as one of the main challenges. So I think this is really important to highlight that these are essentially the same problem that can be solved by these two groups or these two parties collaborating. So to conclude, what I tried to argue for here is that digital language technology for Nahuatl and Maya and other Mesoamerican languages can be very valuable for engaging with indigenous histories, knowledges, and cultural practices by enabling the analysis of and access to historical documents, and also by supporting language documentation, revitalization, and language teaching efforts. And since these languages don't have huge volumes of labeled linguistic data, the solutions often look like knowledge-based or rules-based approaches. And these can then be used to seed data-driven methods. And the other approach that's very common is the use of pre-trained or multilingual models so that there's less total data needed to produce a well-performing model. And finally, aligning research and NLP development with indigenous communities is the key. And so the idea of free and open software, free and open source software and resources is very important, as well as prioritizing and involving the interests of indigenous communities in every aspect of these projects. So thank you very much. I think my time is up. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, super interesting. So please remember you can still put the questions on the Q&A panel. So I already have my list. So next we have Ignatius Ezeani. He's going to be presenting NLP and large language models, a case for inclusive language technologies. So his presentation, he's asking, so in today's diverse world, the need for inclusive languages technologies cannot be overemphasized. By acknowledging and addressing the biases of promoting acknowledging and addressing the bias of promoting representation and accommodating diverse linguistic and cultural contexts, inclusive language technologies can foster for equitable communication and empower marginalized communities. So Ignatius Ezeani is a senior researcher associate at Lancaster University and is a visiting lecturer at the Nnamdi Azikiwe University of Nigeria. He holds a BSc in computer science and a master's in science in advanced software engineering and a PhD in natural language processing. His interests include natural language processing for low resource, mostly African languages and related areas. He's interested in corpus linguistics, spatial humanities, information retrieval, and extraction of machine learning and generative AI. So Rob, whenever you're ready, sorry, Ignatius, whenever you're ready, please go ahead and start your presentation. Thank you.
Rob did a very interesting presentation. All right, thank you. Can you hear me to start with?
Perfect, all good.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Javier and Sophie, for inviting me. Thank you, the audience. I can't see most of your faces, but I've seen you guys are here. Thank you for coming to this talk. So today I'll focus on NLP and large language models and the implication of low resource, particularly African languages, the implication of building models that are inclusive. Before we, okay, let me just see if, okay, yeah, I can move. So the outline basically is, I'm going to be, I won't delve into a particular language, like Rob's presentation focuses on the work they are doing in specific languages. We're going to be talking about the, I'm making a case generally for, well, African, and then in addition to that, other low resource languages. So the structure of my talk will be loosely, structured in this way. So if we look at the potential pitfalls of algorithmic models, that's when they are not working as we expect them to work. Look at some of the challenges that we face. And indeed, Rob touched on some of them towards the end of his talk. And then look at some of the efforts we've made with regards to African languages, and then call everybody to think about ways we can make things better in the future. By way of introduction, I'm not sure why I'm struggling with my, well, yeah, okay, good. By way of introduction, Javier has introduced me, and basically all the things he said is I don't need to repeat this slide. But I want to highlight that apart from African languages, I'm also interested in methods that will help in not just African languages, but other languages that are considered low resource, as well as any other low resource domain, like you're working in maybe healthcare or data for agriculture and things like that. So let us start by looking at potential pitfalls. Like I said, when systems don't work, they pose a problem. most often than not leads to injustice. This is a system that was used in some of the American states for recidivism. This is basically looking at the risk of someone who's caught for a crime reoffending. And then this system, in 2006, Julia Agwin, they published an article on one of these investigative journalism sites that indicate that these systems are biased against people with specific color, in this case, Black. So you can see that for the picture on the left, no, my left should be your left, someone who has prior offenses, 2 armed robberies, 1 attempted armed robbery, has a much lower risk of reoffending than someone who has just 4 juvenile misdemeanor. The other one, someone has attempted burglary, has lower risk of reoffending than the other one. And you see what happened afterwards. Indeed, the system was wrong because eventually these ones with high risk never reoffended again, and the ones with low risk reoffended. So that's one of the things we can see with this. The other thing is, even when we could see the injustice in the other one, but we could also see the propagation of existing biases, prejudices, and racism in some of the systems that we use to build the models that we are using today. And they're not very obvious unless you scrutinize them. What we use them for won't show what they have embedded until somebody goes in to scrutinize them. And that's one of the reasons why it's important that we all have to be hands-on on this, trying to work on it together. Now, what this is about this large data set, the Lion 400 million data set of image per collections, where an image text per collections, an image is given some sort of caption. So they collected it from Common Crawl, and then they used the OpenAI's Clip tool to tag the images. Now, what they said in their method is, if the similarity between the image, the score given to the image, score given to a caption of a particular image is below 0.3, drop that caption. So what that means is that in their data set, the captions labeled B in these 2 pictures will not even feature in their data set because they dropped it. They will, however, project the caption that thinks that a lady astronaut is the smiling housewife in an orange jumpsuit, or that the former president of America is the first illegal president of US born in Kenya. So that's the kind of thing that system will bring up. So, which is not good. I'm not sure the developers of Clip thought that would happen, and I'm not sure the guys who are also building this data set thought that would happen. But that tells us that the source of what we call language models or NLP models today are already filled with a lot of things that we actually don't want. So biases in NLP models, they exist. They happen because we're human beings, and the human-generated data will continue to reflect our biases and stereotypes. And we also have to be very careful, because the way we're going now, it looks like the future will be filled with synthetic data generated by these models we're already building, which are already, biased. So we have to be very careful. And these issues that we do not want to happen, the gender issues, the race issues, the religious issues, they keep being propagated by these models. So that to address it, I think we should start thinking about ways to remove these negative things from the systems that we are building. So yeah, that is me trying to highlight some of the pitfalls. Now let's go to NLP, what it is and what it is for Africa and what we're doing. Good. Natural language processing is, as some of us will know, is a subfield of computer science. and linguistics most of the time. I'm happy that Rob went before me to also give us some of the things we do to extract the human knowledge, the expert knowledge from expert linguists collected in a knowledge base, and use that to build the systems that we sometimes use today, which are, well, I use that to ground the development of the language models that we want to use. But some of the systems we are using today tend to think that there is no need for that kind of linguistics coming in, that kind of human knowledge coming in, and that's one thing we have to really get against. So it focuses on the computational processing of human language, and it may be text, but it can also be images, videos, maybe sign language, all sorts of ways we communicate. It tries to understand them and then reproduce them, generate them in some way. And that's why we call them generative models. Okay, so why we need them is because the amount of information that we have to deal with now is excessive. It's incredible. There is no way we can make sense of what's going on in our world today if we do not have a set of tools that help us to drill into that and find out, extract for us some sort of meaningful patterns from the pile, and represent it in some structure that we are interested in, and then we can use it in whatever we are doing. We cannot do that. It's obvious that we list a set of tools and techniques. And NLP is not easy. It's not easy because human language is not very straightforward. You have to, depending on the context, you have to try to figure out what the meanings are, for instance. And that's usually a problem. So if you look at these potential newspaper headlines, and I can assure you, I didn't know about what's going on in the news right now before I put this together. But you find out that Israeli Head 6 is already featuring things like head and arm, which could, in most places that they occur, will be human body parts rather than anything to do with the head of a country or arms, ammunitions for war and things like that. And then you go down and you find out that it's usually difficult if you look at it from the human perspective. It's difficult to create systems with just a set of rules that will be able to identify what's going on in this case and be able to generalize very well when it meets another case where the meaning has changed. And that's why maybe some of the rule-based models that will require people who have knowledge about the language to build systems that will understand the language, some of them are not working. At some point they fail, but otherwise they have better quality. And language is language evolves. So even if you capture certain things that's happening, language is not it's not a closed set of vocabulary that you're using. Things happen, things change. The way you mix language and use them change over time. But as human beings, we understand that. The models we are building may not necessarily understand that. Okay, and therefore, normally what people were doing traditionally would be to use these methods. We tokenize systems, parse them, lematize them, stem them, morphological segmentation, all sorts of things that we can easily write small rules for, and they do that for us. Then we tie them together, and then they do other things for us. They do bigger things like machine translation, like question answering, including some of the things that we take for granted now, suggesting, automatic correction of text when you're typing text suggestion and so on and so forth. The core of creating some of these things originated from some of these steps. However, when we use them at this point, we want to answer questions like this, we will find out that most often than not, they perform below expectation if they don't understand the context, or if you move them away from what you have trained them on. Okay, so and also if you go beyond this and go to other a complex mix of different tasks, for instance, in this task, you want to speak to a system, and that system speaks another language back to you. Maybe you speak English and they speak French, so for instance, to you, which is useful if you are traveling and you're in another country and you see yourself struggling to communicate with people. You might use that kind of system. What does happen is that there will have to be some sort of system that helps you do speech recognition and put it in that text, and then there will be some sort of machine translation that goes on. And then it understands that in textual formats in another language, and then it does this text-to-speech synthesis. So it's like it's not really as straightforward as you think it is. There's a number of systems that are working together. So that's originally how we were doing it. But large language models happened. They happened because at some point, I don't know, within the last, I mean, it's not very far away now. Within the last, say, 10 years, we began to see things like embedding models and neural networks began to work better. And then people found out that we can also more powerful compute for them, and then began to expand these things. And big tech companies can afford the resources, and then they started creating that. So it is basically the same thing, machine learning functions that predicts and generates plausible language. Any language that you look at and you think, oh yeah, that looks like something a human being will write, is what large language models try to do. They do everything we do now. They are in the arts, they are in the society, they are in audio, they are in video, trying to do the same thing we have been doing because they have collected all the information that we've been dumping on the internet, and they can do that. So the problem is that we don't sometimes know what they are doing. That's the problem. And the term large refers to how large the parameters, that is the weights learned by these models are, or how much data that's used to train them. So some of the ones you may have heard about, for instance, the GPT family of models, the Llama family models, and you can identify who the developers are. They are the people who control what's going on here. I don't have enough space to list every one of them. But the thing is, it has already started becoming really large at this point. We didn't need billions of text to train a typical NLP model before, but we have started about I don't know, 5-6 years ago. It started becoming really, really very large, and it's becoming larger. Llama 3 came out a few weeks ago. I don't know, or a few days ago. I'm not sure. And they're telling us that that's actually not going to be what they're releasing. They just want to push the market and then hold it and then release something much bigger. So we're going to be seeing much larger models. And of course, you probably had this last week. I don't know if any of you had this, but this is rhetorical. I'm not expecting you to answer, but if you don't know, I also asked Copilot to answer that for me. GPT is the dumbest model any of you will ever have to use again by a lot. And he said, well, yeah, this is what was made by Sam Altman. So he was in Stanford last 3 days or so ago, and was giving a talk. And then, he was asked questions like that. I mean, it was all over the internet, probably saw that. But Copilot, who is also on the internet with us, knows the question, answers it, understands what's going on all over the world. And that's the beauty and the power of the kind of models that we are building today. However, these models do not work for some languages, and that's what we need to be watchful for. They don't work for some languages. I'm just citing one of the papers here that was recently done. I think it was released this year by some members of the Master Kernel group that looked at these models, GPT-2 and Llama 2 and GPT-4 are models that are not very multilingual, compared it with those that are a bit more multilingual. And they found out that fine-tuning that on some of these tasks, classification tasks, generation tasks, will actually give better results, which means that the more you try to diversify, the more you try to include other languages, their patterns, the nuances of those languages, the better the model performs, because it captures a much wider concept of knowledge than a model that's tailored to a single language or a few Western languages will capture. Okay, so it doesn't work for us, okay? So for instance, one example is if you ask Copilot or GPT-4, what is Ubuntu? This is what you get. Is there anybody here who thinks this is correct? I don't know. I don't know if I can see the chat. But depending on who you ask, Ubuntu is not a Linux distribution. It is not. I mean, a Linux distribution was given that name Ubuntu, okay? But it is not. Ubuntu is a concept, a South African, an African concept that helps us to remember that we are there for ourselves. You are because I am. Is a concept that emphasizes community. But nowhere did Copilot say, well, I understand in this context it means this, in that context it means that. So it's actually taking it away again from the owner and then called it whatever it wanted, because this is what it saw on the internet. It doesn't know the meaning of the word. Okay, and we trust it to tell us what we'll do because we think it knows more than we do. Anyway, the reason is that, like Rob said in his presentation, the owners of the languages, sometimes they're not really involved. About 5 years ago, this I put this back up because I haven't seen an updated version of it. But about 5 years ago, somebody sat down and looked at the SCL conferences, some of the major SCL, NLP conferences, so SCL, NACO, EMNLP, Colin, and all that, and then looked at where the auto affiliations are coming from. So even when they are actually working on their individual languages, they're affiliated to, I am in Lancaster, for instance, they're affiliated to other places. And unless you are able to afford it, I mean, Rob highlighted it as well. Unless you're able to afford to participate, you don't. So people are not coming from these places. That's one of the things that motivated some of the efforts that we began to do, which I'm going to talk about later. So, also there's a paper that looked at the distribution of the data sets that are available to people who are working in NLP, for instance. So to cut it short, I've put in all these references in this, and I'm sure that hopefully the slides will be available to people to actually explore. But this paper, the set and fate of linguistic diversity and inclusion in NLP world, made it clear that most of the African languages, they are either the left behind or the scraping by. So if you look at the left behind, those are the one with 0, which is they have very little labeled data. They have even a lot of very little unlabeled data. That's where they belong. They're large, but that's where they belong. Then the scraping by are those who are struggling to get some unlabeled data. They don't have the resources to actually label their data and all that. And obviously, you cannot really get into this world of NLP development without data, okay? So that's one challenge. And again, 2 years ago or so, Ruda is on his blog also. I don't know if I think he took this from, but this diagram is something you will see somewhere on the internet as well. But I took it from this source. And you look at if we redo, I can bet you that if we redo this diagram now for 2024 April, it will even be worse, because these new models, which have not featured here, the Llama 3, the GPT-4, 5, and all that, they will be towards the bottom right, which is where we have the large models that are also not multilingual or not very multilingual. You know, when they say they're multilingual, it means that they saw a piece of one African language, there, and then they think that's multilingual, but it's not. It's when you can do meaningful tasks with them in those languages to say that it's multilingual. Okay, I'll give you another graph before I finish with the graphs. Okay, so this is a bit more recent. I think it was in 2023. They looked at the coloniality that they begin to see in some of the the processes that give rise to these large language models. So if you look at this, you'll see again that when people are asked whether they use GPUs in their work, most of the people who could afford to use GPUs for their work are not from Africa, for instance, or they're not from the global south, if you like. Okay, so I mean, the graph said that. And then the site, I think, in the introduction of their work, where they got the concept of coloniality, that refers to the long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration. So we are not in colonization, but coloniality keeps seeping in because, I mean, inadvertently, these systems are developing themselves and then beginning to widen the gap again. So digitally, we have one set of people in one end and the other in the other end. Okay, so yeah, if you then apply these models as they've been trained, you get things like this. I mean, they don't seem mission critical. If in software development, we kind of think about the implication of any kind of failure, right? So we don't see this failure because usually people try to use this in a way that doesn't make this obvious. But if you ask a model, oh, show me African people at work, these are two different models that were prompted. And then African people at work here. And this was done like a year ago. So maybe these models are now a bit more intelligent in trying to sort this out. However, this can happen, okay? So, all right. So indeed, what's actually driving what we are doing is that it's important, like Rob also mentioned, I didn't want to zoom into different African languages that some of the members of the Massacre are working on, but this is one of the core principles that drive what we're doing, that if we begin to lose our belief in our names, obviously that's obvious, because sometimes when you use certain systems and you type your name, it will underline your name as if it's wrong, but it's not. It's just that it doesn't know your name. And it's a big system, but it doesn't know your name. In their languages, in their environments, in their heritage, and so on. Ultimately, they will lose. They will not believe in themselves again, and that's exactly where you don't want people to be, because we're all interconnected. All right. So the solution. Well, there are all sorts of initiatives going on, but I just want to talk about this for want of time, because yeah, Masakane is a grassroots NLP community for African. I don't think there's any other initiative that drives the essence of African NLP than Masakane. It's given rise to a lot of things. A little bit of, I joined Masakane a bit late, but I know when it started because in 2018, there was what we call the Deep Learning Indaba in South Africa. And it was really some Africans who work in the big tech companies come down to see if they can get African students in some sort of summer school arrangement to understand what's going on in that industry. And, Masakane was vetted. I can tell you that the core principle for Masakane is that it will have to be a participatory approach. We are aware that most of the African students, they're not exposed to what's happening in the Western world. They are intelligent, but they don't have the tools and the facilities to work. So it was good to bring everybody on board and let those who have mentor those who don't have, and let them participate, because they know more about what we want to create than we do. And then the speaker community needed to be involved. We collaborate and partner with different other communities, and our aim is to capture the local perspectives and the needs. So any system that we are building must address the needs of the community that we are building it for. Okay. So far, 2,709 members. This is like a conservative estimate because I could get this from the Slack channel. I'm sure there are so many other people who are affiliated with Masakane who are not on Slack, but a lot of publications have come from that. We have also vetted the African NLP workshop series. The 5th edition, I think, is happening this week in Austria. There are multiple research grants. Lacuna Fund I know of because I'm also I'm going to talk about that a little bit and end with it. And the mentoring and the training program, which is going on, allowing those who have experience, who are in the Western, to come down and work with those who are not. So bridging that gap in knowledge is actually one of the ones I'm very, very, very passionate about. And the PhD and postdoc opportunities that we have managed to generate. And then conference sponsorship. Well, before Master Ken, it was difficult to get conferences to make allowance for people to travel from Africa to conferences. So they weren't really getting that exposure that they needed. Anyway, Lacuna Fund is one of the other things that happened recently that was really good. I was part of it 2 years as a technical advisory panel member. And we were asked to identify gaps, data gaps, develop the RFPs and review them. And then when the data sets are created, we help also to point people in that direction. So, which is part of what I'm doing too. The areas to focus on, although we don't have enough textual data, like Rob said, we have some speech data we can collect. We have the radio programs and the outputs. People actually speak their languages. We can also collect speech data as well. So we focus on that. We focus on machine translation and other similar tasks. We focus on the fact that some of our texts are also code switched. So if you're colonized, you're going to be speaking your language and be speaking other languages, and so on and so forth. So you have to think about models that do well in that kind of scenario. All right. Okay. So the guiding principle from day one, which is also what I thought made me feel it's what getting involved in that, is that it has to be accessible. I mean, we cannot lock up what we have created behind paywalls. It has to be equitable. It has to, emphasize ethical approach. Then, like I said, participatory approach is part of it. The quality of the data set is also more like guaranteed because we are in the process is designed to also scrutinize what's going on at every stage. But finally, the transformational impact. It really, really needs to serve the interests of the community. All right. So Lacuna made a lot of, support a lot of projects. If you go to their website, which I've linked here, you will see a lot of the projects. And these are just the projects on language development. There are so many other things on health, on agriculture, and I think some other things that they funded. So it was really, really a big boost. And it was because we have a community in the Masakane that could leverage that and made it abundantly easier for us. Okay, so these are all the other ones. I won't waste time on them. Okay, so if you go to Hugging Face now, there are a lot of models that we created that are targeting African problems, solving African problems the way we want it. Just before I close, I really want to quote one of the participants in one of the projects, the Niger Voices. So collecting speech data sets in 3 core Nigerian languages, Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba. It is also funded by Lacuna. And she said, I just kind of took some of this from her interview. I call it a revolution. It has already started. That is what Lacuna has succeeded in doing for Africa. By providing the audio data sets, we will be enabling inventions in voice technologies used in education, health, agriculture, technologies that will address African problems in the languages and in the ways Africans understand. That is really good. So finally, we must realize that the internet by its nature is biased. The models, including the large language models that are based on the internet, they will keep propagating the known biases and prejudices. We need to diversify and democratize the process. The entire pipeline, the data collection, the annotation, the modeling, everything that we do will have to we'll have to think about a way to get people involved, get people that are concerned to be part of it. We need to look at less costly and data efficient approaches. We cannot prize out the people who are the owners of the language. We cannot prize them out in the whole process, okay? And then we must make sure that the solutions that we're going to create, we think about the solution even before we start creating the data set, that they are serving the people. And then everybody will need to be involved. Policymakers, academics, funders, big tech companies will also need to be involved. So I have also given a few other interviews on this matter and shared my thoughts. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ignatius. Let's remove the spotlight. Perfect. So I will welcome Robert back to the screen. So I stopped sharing your screen, so yeah, we can jump into the Q&A. So as a reminder, everybody feel free to raise your hand, and I will can enable you to turn on your microphone, or you can use the Q&A. Which I think this first question will be for both of you. So so someone is asking in the Q&A panel that I mean, they're very interested in how AI pipelines and AI processes are viewed or understood from the Global South perspective, so especially indigenous or Latin American and African. So in your experience, are African and indigenous communities engaging with AI differently than their Western counterparts? And do they hold different views of the phenomenology of the emergence of AI? So Ignatius, I don't know if you have a perspective of how AI is viewed in outside of the global north.
Yeah, is Rob okay? Yeah, okay. I can see Rob to see if he wants to chime in.
Yeah.
So the question was, are we Africans, are we engaging in a different way with AI? And the other one was what? So I want to take them together. Javier, sorry.
Yes. So yeah, still mute. Yeah. So yeah. So are the communities engaging differently with AI? And what is their different views of the phenomenology of AI? So what is happening with AI, and how do they see it?
Yeah. My answer, and that's my answer. I don't think I don't want to be quoted on that. My answer is that yes, we indeed are. You know, we in most places we're still dealing with, you know, the daily survival issues. That's one thing. The other thing is that what we do with technologies in the West is sometimes isn't we do not have the structures and the infrastructure to actually deploy that. So to some extent, we cannot engage directly. We don't have the capacity, if you like, to engage directly with AI. Well, we see that, you know, it's improving day by day, that internet penetration is increasing and people are getting more and more on their phones and all that. But ultimately, it should be the same way. It's just that the where we are, we're still catching up a lot. Everything that's happening is catching up. So the systems that we are deploying for so many of the AI use cases in the West, sometimes they're not even in the global South. I'll talk about Nigeria, where I'm from. We don't have the infrastructures and the systems to actually deploy them. So yeah, to that extent, we're engaging with them differently. But on the other hand, what people can actually assess, they are not really different. During the last election, early this year and last year, Nigerians were fully on the internet. They were there discussing the political issues that matter to them. And they were generating content. Again, you know, like I always say, the challenge is that all the things that they poured on the internet, because they're quite expressive, all the things that are poured on the internet didn't quite capture their languages as they should for future, and better analysis and understanding. So I think there is a slight difference, just to make it not too long, in the way we do things. But the technology is coming too hard on us and we're catching up. So it's important that at this point we kind of hold it off a little bit and then find out if the models and systems that we are consuming are dealing, because they're not built for us. They're solving the problems that we want them to solve in the way we want them to solve them. So that's the way I will address that issue. I don't know whoever asked it if that answered your question, and I'm sorry if I haven't, but that's the way it comes.
Yeah. Rob, I don't know if you would like to step in. Do you have any
that was a great
perspective?
answer. I think that was a great answer. So I agree generally with all of those points. I think the question about engaging in AI technologies, like Ignatius just said, I think it's hard to say anything about that, given the fact that most contemporary AI technologies are not really built with indigenous or the global south in mind. And so, yeah, I think that's a matter of, in general, there's probably a lot of similarities in the way people conceive of AI, assuming it's built for them as well. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think that kind of question follows up with a little bit with the question that has been answered on the Q&A panel, and is the role of that I mean, it is my impression that the vast majority of technologies that are coming from the global north are rendered useless once we bring the knowledge from the global south. So there's actually a question as well that mentions, for example, how do you deal with that? How do you bring in new knowledge into the system that exists? And for example, Robert, you show this tool that you use to do the automatic transcription and the linguistic segmentation of the words. So how much do you have to create these tools from scratch? Because existing tools were actually useless, and this applies for geographic information systems, for cataloging records, for NLP. So I don't know if you have for both of you, if you have a little bit to expand on what are the challenges in terms of the technologies, how much you have to start from scratch, how much you have to rebuild. So for example, from the perspective of decolonization, we have to relearn. So in that way, the tools have to be redesigned to actually be used for non-global north knowledge. I don't know if you can expand a little bit more on that.
So I have a really simple example of this that I think is relevant. So I talked a little bit about the idea of predictive keyboards as a possible tool for sort of enabling communication online. And so I've been looking into recently a lot of existing solutions for integrating new languages into a predictive keyboard system for a mobile device. And one of the challenges is that a lot of the existing systems are built in a way where you define a dictionary of words, and you give a frequency of these words, and that's how the model knows what word is most likely to predict next, or what word is most likely to make a correction to if you mistype something. The problem for languages like Nahuatl is that because of the rich morphology and the large amount of inflection in the words, you frequently will get words that have never even been seen in a corpus before. And so this idea of a word-based system for predicting, for correcting spellings and things like that doesn't really work for polysynthetic languages, which describes a lot of the languages in sort of in Latin America, indigenous languages. And so I think that's an example of the existing technology. You can build it to support another language, but it doesn't really make sense the way it's designed. And so it really requires a rethinking of the infrastructure of the entire application.
Yeah.
Then for you, Ignatius, have you had the same
experience?
Yeah,
I completely agree with Rob. One example that came to my mind is when I started working on Igbo NLP, and I was going to do diacritic restoration. So Igbo has these dots that attached to some letters, so to change their sound, if you like. So diacritics, I'm sure some people here will know what I'm talking about. And to actually motivate that research, I had to actually look for a way to kind of try to use systems, because by then we don't have a keyboard that will help us insert those diacritics. So systems like Google Translate and all that try to do without it. So you're gonna type something on the internet anyway to search for something without it. And I did that. And it failed in so many places. Okay. It failed in so many places. It's better now, by the way, between then and now. But it failed in so many places. And that was a good motivating factor for me to go into that. And we have to do that. I cannot recreate a translation at that time anyway. I couldn't recreate a translation system that would be better than what Google Translate was doing then. But we have to modify what they're doing so that we will be able to. So we have to layer on top of that some sort of diacritic restorer, which will be able to go into that. So it's not always, but you know that is me. An ordinary user doesn't know what to do with that tool. The two things will happen. It's either they use it and believe that is giving them the best that they can use, or they don't use it at all and then don't even get any benefit from that, which makes it difficult. Do you start from the beginning? Sometimes you have to, depending on the niche area. That's why I'm no longer not focusing on just low resource language. I'm focusing on low resource domains. I've worked in other languages. I've worked with Welsh, for instance. It's not just African languages. There are some languages in the West that are being squeezed out of what's going on because English and Spanish and French are really massive. Yeah. So the individual languages in other places, I'm talking about the United Kingdom here, where we have different languages. We have the Irish, we have the other Celtic languages. Last week, I was giving a talk on the Celtic language development. So it makes what's happening is you are in that system, you are forced, you are sucked into it, but you can't use it. So you're kind of struggling to assert yourself. And that's a challenge. That is something it does to your head. You know, as little as you type your name, and the system says that your name needs to be corrected because it says there's a spelling error in your name. And if you're wondering, I mean, haven't you heard of a name like this from this is so place? You should have had. I thought so. It makes you feel you don't belong. You know, that is the way I look at it. So I think that we need to be very intentional in trying to define processes that allow us to check. To be honest, the big tech companies, that's not what they're thinking about. Llama is out, so GPT-5 will be out. That's all. It needs to come out. And that's what they're thinking about. They're not thinking about this. And then we will keep thinking about how we will fine-tune this for our systems. Okay. I mentioned I didn't quite have time to talk about it more. I stumbled upon this baby LM challenge thing. And I think it's fascinating because the point they're trying to make is that it takes only less than about 100 million words for a 13-year-old to be quite intelligent. Very, very small. But Bet is trained on 3-point-something billion words. Is there a way we can actually embed intelligence in the models that is good enough for us to achieve certain tasks? Because it's important. The guys in the global south, they don't have the compute resources that we have up here. Okay, so it's important that we start thinking about lean, efficient, less costly approaches to these things. Yeah.
Yeah, so actually last week we had a presentation from the Digital Pacific project, and yeah, they were mentioning about most of the technologies cannot be used over there. So yeah, so the Pacific Islands have a very similar approach to, I mean, as many populations in the global south, which then links to the idea of how much of the knowledge that is locked because of the linguistic determinism, text as a technological imposition, how much of that knowledge is hidden, and how do we link it back in, let's say, to cultural heritage organization, cultural heritage collections? So, for example, Ignatius, and you as well, Robert, you mentioned the idea of adding meaning. But unless how do we add the meaning? How do we connect that knowledge that is locked out from the global north systems into, let's say, digital collections or cultural heritage, or, well, knowledge infrastructures in general? So now you have any observations here?
Yeah,
Rob, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Like one of the takeaways from my presentation was I was trying to say that I guess in order to do this, in order to be able to incorporate these knowledges that currently are excluded, I think it's instead of approaching it from the perspective of integrating the global south into existing systems, it is to work so that indigenous populations build their own solutions, right? So the solutions exist for the problems that they have that's relevant to their lives. And so I think that's probably the best, in my opinion, the best way to approach that problem.
I completely agree. I have nothing to add there. And building their solutions, it will look like reinventing the wheel, but it's not, because we already have the tools and the methods. I mean, the techniques and the methods. So I think that's where they have to start, not necessarily from scratch, but build their own.
Yeah, I agree completely. Yeah, sometimes it's difficult to say we have to throw it to the bin and then start from scratch, but because that's the least thing we want to do, like reinvest on something that's been created. But let me just finish with the another question from the chat, well, from the Q&A, and it's for Ignatius mainly. So they were interested about Indo-European languages. So what are some of the, if you can expand a little bit more on what are some of the similarities and differences in the challenges of working with minor Indo-European languages, like Welsh and African languages in this context? So I don't know if you have any observations here.
So, Javier, sorry, I got a bit, my kids are coming back from school, so I got a bit.
Don't worry. Yeah, so they were asking if you were able to expand on the similarities of working with Indo-European languages such as Welsh and African languages. So are the challenges the same, or what do you see the differences?
Well, obviously the languages, Igbo, for instance, is very agglutinative and morphologically rich. But I think that the core challenge we have is that, unlike the kind of support the Welsh government gives to developing the system, we don't get it for our own languages. So we need to scout for help from other places. And you can understand why that would be the case. Actually, the Niger Voices, it was just on 3 major languages in Nigeria, but actually Nigeria has more than 400 languages. Okay, so when we're done dealing with the major languages, then you come back to the minor languages in Nigeria as well. So you need to, it's going down that. So basically, the difference in the challenges that I had, from where I stand, is that we have a lot of support from the Welsh government saying this is embedded in our policy. We need to promote our language. Okay. And then they begin to impose that. In Nigeria, you don't do your education in Igbo or Hausa, you don't do university education in Igbo, Hausa, or Yoruba, to use the major languages. You don't conduct what's it called, parliamentary discussions or politics in any of these languages. So unless you're down local to your people and you're doing a campaign, I'm not sure that many of them have even Igbo or Yoruba or Hausa newspapers now. So the system is already nudged towards not encouraging these languages to grow. So they're still alive because people are making these individual efforts here and there trying to rebuild the community. Okay, so luckily, one of the things that helping is that young people on TikTok, on Facebook, are creating content in these languages as well. So we're going to have a collection of different things that we might use in future for work. So because these languages are spoken and used by people. So, but in Welsh, like I said, I was at the Celtic. I saw a lot of the things that people were doing that are, going to help those who are creating these languages to generate resources that they need for what they are doing, both material resources and language resources as well. Yeah, so that's the challenge. That's the difference in the experience I have with both of them.
Thank you. I don't know, Robbie, well, unless you wanted to add something. Okay, so yeah, I think we just run out of time. But again, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Ignatius, for these super amazing presentations. And yeah, it was very interesting to see other perspectives of how the work is being done, and all the road that we still need to travel from the global north to the global south. So at least this gives some examples of how things are being done outside of our spheres. So yeah, so thank you everybody for joining.